Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as we continue to explore and go into more depth around permitting reform, one of our primary asks this lobby day. We have a really excellent panel with a lot of different perspectives on why permitting reform is important and different perspectives on the details and what's needed in a package. And I think this will be a real good look at some of the things we might not have gotten to last night when we were talking about permitting reform. But let me first just introduce our panel. We have Arnab Datta, Director of Infrastructure Policy at the Institute for Progress. CCL alumni, Kyle Kammien, who's now Policy Director for Green for All and Dream.org. David Pala, Marketing Communications Director for the International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, Local 26. Is that right? And Corey Schrodt, Director of Government Affairs at the Niskanen Center. And of course, I'm Ben Pendergrass, CCL's Vice President of Government Affairs. And we can get started, but this is a lot of information on this panel, and we've actually been in the trenches with some of these guys for a while. I mean, Corey and I have been in the trenches for like, what, 6 or 7 years on a lot of stuff. But let's just start off. If you guys could just give a brief overview of your orgs and kind of like what you bring to this conversation. We'll start at the end.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting this this great event. So the Institute for Progress is a DC-based think tank that is committed to advancing scientific, technological, and industrial progress. And a big portion of the work that we've been doing, particularly on our infrastructure team, is oriented around permitting reform and how we can accelerate the clean energy build-out and what are the barriers to it. We've done some work specifically on permitting reform and the barriers as it relates to the judicial system and the role that the judicial system plays in kind of stopping clean energy projects from getting built. We've done some work about the regulatory mismatch, I guess you could say, between fossil fuels and versus clean energy. And we did a big series on geothermal energy and what it would take to advance and accelerate next generation geothermal technology. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Kyle?
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back here with CCL and with CCLers. Thank you. Dream.org is a nonpartisan advocacy nonprofit. We're focused on closing prison doors and opening the doors of opportunity in the green economy for all. What that looks like in our day-to-day work is really focusing on ensuring that benefits from laws like the infrastructure law, the IRA, are flowing to the communities that need them most and that we're intended to receive them. And so, we feel that a big component of that is definitely permitting reform. A lot of those benefits can't be realized without permitting reform, and I'll discuss that a little bit more later, but thanks for having me.
Corey Schrodt, Niskanen Center. So the Niskanen Center is a relatively young think tank. We have a series of departments, a wide array of departments, of course highlighted by our climate department, which is why we're here talking about permitting reform, but we also have an immigration component, state capacity component, criminal justice component, and several others, but looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, I'm David Pala. I'm representing the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 26. We have about, thank you. We have about 13,000 members, electricians in the DMV. So that is 5 counties in Maryland, the District of Columbia, and 44 counties in Virginia. Why is this important to us? Well, electricians are the folks who install and implement our new green economy, right? So when we're talking about electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, whether we're talking about utility scale solar farms, whether we're talking about decarbonization, electrification, offshore wind, all of those things, it's our members who actually go in and build these programs, and it's our training programs and apprenticeships that help folks get ready for all of that work. So this is incredibly important for us. We've been advocating at a local and state level to make sure that as many of these projects go forward as possible, and I'm excited to share my experiences on the ground in the trenches trying to get these things approved.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate that. And David, you kind of set up the next question, like why permitting reform is important to you guys' organizations and why you kind of zeroed in on that being a policy you wanted to work on. I think you just answered it for yourself, so we can like go back down the line and you guys can give your quick take of why your org's just zeroed in on this being a problem.
Yeah, so Niskanen Center, we're a market-based solutions organization. We see permitting as a roadblock to actually opening up an efficient and effective electricity market. We see clean energy as the main beneficiary of any kind of permitting reform, regardless of what the focus is. We see the expansive investment and push towards renewables as a clear winner in any kind of permitting reform scenario.
Yeah, for DREAM, as I mentioned earlier, like we try to focus on communities, and so for communities that are overburdened with pollution and in need of investment, these projects, these clean energy projects, can't come soon enough in order to actually realize those benefits. And our perspective is that Congress needs to take action because in communities where pollution is causing harm, that harm is continuing as long as we are, unable to build the clean energy infrastructure to reduce that pollution. And projects are taking too long, and time and clarity of process are really needed and essential.
I guess I'll keep it simple. Energy is really good. It makes our lives a lot better in a lot of ways. It makes our standards of living better. I think as an advocacy organization, we've been really compelled by this concept a friend of mine, Derek Thompson, has written about called the abundance agenda, but the idea that we can have a better future, a more abundant future of good things for everyone. And so I think if we're going to have an abundant future, we need to have a lot more energy build out. And right now, permitting is a major barrier to that. It's a major barrier to doing it more clean as well. And I would also add, as an organization committed to scientific and technological progress, a lot of scientific innovation and commercialization relies on very large amounts of energy. And so if you take something like the AI build-out, which is reliant on data centers that consume enormous amounts of energy and electricity and require enormous amounts of energy to cool, if you don't have a reliable grid of clean, firm energy that can be constantly producing that, you're not going to be able to lead the AI innovation race. And so that's something, as Americans, we feel are, I'm actually not American, I'm Canadian. But, nonetheless, in about 9 months I'll be American. But we'll have that, we want to lead that. So I think that's really important.
Don't worry, we have some Canadians. Those are great explanations. And one thing we didn't really get into details is some of the components that we need. And I know Corey Niskanen just did some great work on transmission and some of the barriers specifically to transmission and linear infrastructure generally. You want to tell us a little bit about what you guys found when you did that study?
Yeah, we did a study looking at transmission lines being built from, and these are large-scale, high-capacity merchant lines, not your in your neighborhood power lines that are going around the block. These are multi-state, sometimes single-state, but still pretty big capacity lines from 2010 to 2020, and what roadblocks they faced along the way. And one of the striking pieces that we found was that it took at least 7 years to get any of these projects through the process and even start breaking ground. With the scale of the build-out that's expected in the transmission space or expected to be needed, I think the estimates are somewhere between 3 and 4 times the amount that we currently have. That timeline is absolutely unacceptable. We found a few instances where you can shrink some of those timelines down to 3 to 4 years of doing concurrent EIS. So if you have multiple agencies that have to look at an EIS or a NEPA review, collapsing that into running them concurrently, doing some of the processes at the same time, gets you a little bit of the way there. But I think there's a bigger conversation needed around some of the NEPA conversation, which I think Arnab is going to get into. that would really help unlock some of those shorter timelines.
Well, I think that's a good point. We can throw it over to Arnab to talk about some of the judicial review issues, because we know, that's a big component, but we haven't discussed it in depth here that much. So I'm really curious to hear your take and what's needed.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the conversation around permitting reform, not necessarily wrongfully, focuses on this front end aspect of it, which is actually getting the permit, approved and in the door. But there's this whole back end of it that happens in our judicial system, something that we call the litigation doom loop, which is essentially this cycle of review, lawsuit, new review, new lawsuit that holds up and creates a lot of these major delays. And the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, was a law passed in the 70s. And it was a good law at the time. It was something that, there's very good reasons why why we passed that in the 70s. We had problems with acid rain and all these different kinds of things. But over the course of the last several decades, it's been weaponized as essentially a tool to block projects of all kinds. And the result of that is this litigation doom loop. And what we're seeing now is this has increasingly become a burden on clean energy deployment over fossil fuel. It's a common thing that people will say, well, NEPA is a tool for blocking fossil fuels. But when you look at a lot of the major projects that are now getting blocked, things like the Cardinal Hickory transmission line, which would connect hundreds of clean energy projects to our grid, or the big solar Cape Wind solar wind project in off the coast of Massachusetts. These are enormous clean projects that are getting weaponized by a small group of people who just don't want to see them get built. And so we have to really, really wrestle with the fact that if we can't deal with that back end problem, it's very, very difficult for developers to actually, put capital towards these projects. Particularly when you think about clean energy, it's not a commodity that they're producing. The thing that really costs a lot is the upfront capital cost. And so if you can't have some predictability of when your project is going to get approved and when you could start building, particularly in an environment of high interest rates, it's very, very difficult to account for and deploy that capital. And so we really think that unless we can solve that, overhang that hangs over developers, we're really just not going to have the clean energy build out that we need.
Can you go a little bit more in depth? Like, what do you think that looks like? What's the most effective strategy? Is it changing the statute of limitations? Is it standing? Like, give us some of those policy aspects.
Yeah, so I think, when standing statute of limitations are things that are, have been thrown around a lot in the context of negotiations. I think it's important to note, those are not requirements that will prevent bad faith litigants from ever filing a lawsuit. I'm a lawyer. We've got other lawyers on the panel here. We can meet deadlines pretty well when we want to put our mind to it. So it's not, those are important changes and they might help at the margins. But really, unless we're doing something that gives, either gives agencies more deference, as in, if an agency conducts a review, there needs to be a certain level of deference that review should get. And there's also, in their process, there's a lot of trade-offs that happen in project design, and those things need to be treated with deference as well, because they've, arisen out of a democratically legitimate process and elected, an agency doing it. The other part of it is, at some point, we need to take, the ability to just stop projects out of the hands of judges. And so the thing that we've really been pushing for is to have a time limit on how long an injunction against a project can be issued. And whether that is, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, even 10 years, the value of, developers being able to know that at some point they can break ground on a project, even if more environmental review is still conducted for other aspects of that project, at least they can start building. Mm-hmm. That would be a major win. That's
great. I think it's really helpful. David, I think you can probably give us better view of like how that actually looks on the ground and how it's affecting your members and just some of those barriers as they are experienced by industry.
Yeah, so I'll start with transmission lines and then talk a little bit about utility scale solar, because we run into, I think, a lot of the same kind of siting issues in both. So we actually have a massive transmission line that we're gearing up for a fight and coming into Loudoun County. Now, a lot of folks will say, yeah, it's because of the data center industry, and that may partially be the case, but when you look about the power that's allocated for those lines coming in, only about 40% is upcoming large projects. The rest of it, 60% of that power, is connecting to renewable sources at other parts of the grid. So this is just another thing that we need to be talking about. A lot of these infrastructure improvements for moving power from one place to another, it's not just so that we use more power in another area, it's actually as we decommission oil fire and coal fire power plants and things of that nature, we're gonna need the infrastructure to make sure that everything's interconnected. Why is it important for us? It's important because our workers need to have access to large-scale projects so that we can keep them working, keeping them paying dues and bringing up the next generation into the apprenticeship. The actions that we've taken in working with developers of all kinds, especially in the renewable space for utility scale solar, is really taking a deep dive into the localities. What are their existing permitting requirements? At the state and local level, when we focus on whether it's transmission lines or whether it's utility scale solar, 90% of that's happening at the local level, with about 10% coming at the state level, say a DEQ study at the last minute to make sure that we can actually set up the solar farms and get interconnected. So what we do is we identify partners who hold the same values as we do, folks who are interested in using high labor standards, so that they can meet the requirements of the IRA and get their 35% tax credit, up to 50 if they're buying American and doing everything the right way. Then we start working with local government, seeing where they're at in the process. So are they going before the Planning Commission? Have they already gone before the Planning Commission and gotten either a recommendation to approve or with changes? And then we go before the Board of Supervisors. So our members, the way that we interact with this process is to do some research to actually learn about the upcoming projects and then engage in campaigns. And it's something that I would encourage everyone here to do, is find out about utility scale solar or important upgraded transmission lines that are going to connect to more clean energy in your area, and find out how to advocate for them. And that means looking at the schedule to see when they're coming up before your locality's planning commissions or when they're coming up to the Board of Supervisors. And I know every state is different. I'm talking specifically about Virginia right now. But in places like Maryland, where local control is dominated, it's most of the same. Places like Ohio might be different. The Ohio Power Siting Board actually makes all of those land use decisions. So if you're from more like some of the Midwest states, then you can actually go before state boards and agencies and talk in favor of these things. But so that's what we do. We learn, we get good partners in the industry, and then we go and we start advocating. And I gotta tell you, it's getting harder and harder. I think every year in 2020, 2021, we probably have half the amount of solar utility scale solar projects and half the gigawattage that we would want to see coming in. So we're getting stronger and stronger organized local opposition, and it's going to take local organized support of people coming out, talking in front of these boards and advocating for why this is important and why it's not just important for your county and the tax revenue, but also for the green economy and upgrading our grid and making sure that we're generating power from clean sources. So that's what we do, that's how we advocate, and I would encourage everyone to learn more about how to do it in your areas as well.
That's great. That local angle's really salient, and obviously there's layers and layers of problems holding up these projects, but I mean, certainly it's not good news when we know we're not getting things to the grid fast enough. I think this year we're on track to have the lowest amount of wattage on offshore wind, or just wind generally, installed since like 15 years ago because of a lot of these permitting issues. But going to that like local level and community engagement side of things, Kyle, you want to talk a little bit about like specifically from your organization, why do you think those benefits are going to really flow to frontline communities and why it's so important?
Yeah, I think, happy to talk about it and, kind of maybe being a little bit less technical than some of my colleagues, but talking about some of the same things. As an organization, thinking about like the quote unquote progressive case for permitting reform, if you will, we kind of see it as an opportunity to both go faster and have better outcomes for communities. In order to maximize the benefits of, clean energy, we're going to need a more robust, more efficient electric grid. And I think, as Corey was talking about earlier with transmission, if we think about like the Grain Belt Express as an example, that line took, I think, 14 years to get permitted and is a good example of like how this current system, just isn't working. We also feel that touching on NEPA, that it's done a lot of good, but that it's imperfect and doesn't really meet the moment. Harms have been caused to communities with NEPA in existence, and now, as it was touched on earlier, studies are showing that it's being used to block solar projects or transmission projects more than fossil fuel projects. So arguably, environmentally beneficial projects, you could say, compared to their peers. So organizationally, thinking about kind of the progressive case, we see it as an opportunity to kind of open up the hood and think about, what's working, what's not, whether things are being used as they were intended to be, and then make changes that inure to the benefit of communities, like creating opportunities for greater participation, like stronger community benefits agreements, et cetera, and that's really the only way like communities meant to receive the benefits of the IRA or whatever piece of legislation we're talking about that has specific provisions, to direct benefits to communities. That's the only way those benefits are going to be achieved, is if those projects and those investments can actually be made. And so that's, when we think about it from our perspective, that's the case that we make.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And I should say, if we are going to get to your guys' questions shortly, and I think there should be some note cards going around. If anybody has questions, you can hold them up, and there should be folks that can come around and grab those. But I do want to get to what's probably a hard question. I'm just going to throw it open, everybody doesn't have to answer it, that we started to explore last night a little bit. We know there's a possibility of a bipartisan package on permitting reform. It's out there. Manchin's been working on it, negotiating with Senate Republicans, particularly John Barrasso. And so we know any package is going to have compromises. And there's going to be some things that we as climate advocates really like, and there's going to be some things that probably don't seem like that climate friendly that we don't like. What do you see as some of those trade-offs in a package that are likely to be included? And why is it okay? Why do you think that clean energy is going to come out on top even with some of those compromises?
I think just to start, it's likely that any good reforms that happen will be at least technology neutral. And that will be seen as something that is like, well, why can't we just do this for clean energy? One thing I think is worth saying is like right now, given where the industries are, clean energy is at a disadvantage when it comes to the permitting regime. There's, these companies have not been doing it for a long time. There's technological uncertainty. There's navigating what these processes look like in the context of new technologies. And if you take something like next-gen geothermal, for example, which is essentially a technology that is physically very similar to fracking and to oil production, but for oil production, there's a categorical exclusion. So you can do exploration wells up to a certain, and geothermal wells don't have that. And so these are things where if we are moving towards a new technology neutral future, that's going to be net positive for clean energy. And particularly when you pair it with the economic financial incentives in the IRA and IAJ and other bills, that's like a big win. That's something we should take as, because right now the regulatory regime and also just staff capacity at a lot of these agencies is better for fossil fuels than it is for clean energy.
So linear infrastructure has a very similar issue where you have natural gas has a very clear federal authority in interstate natural gas pipelines. The rest of the linear infrastructure, so your CO2 pipelines, your transmission, your hydrogen pipelines, don't have the same type of process. They have to go state by state, local entity by local entity, which in certain circumstances makes sense. But when you're in an interstate, when you're trying to build an interstate process, you have to have some kind of threshold of your move, especially with transmission, because I think there's a little more, because you have smaller lines. If you have a high capacity line and you're going across interstate lines, you have to have a clear federal role there. This is, and it's about parity, right? So like we were talking about, it's the tech neutral, the generation neutral nature of having a process that's on parity across all technologies. So natural gas, hydrogen, transmission. I think it's very likely that the way the industry is headed, that's going to be in the favor of clean energy. Especially when you look at what even the oil and gas majors are talking about. The things that they want to do, even if it's CCUS, they have to transport that by CO2 pipelines. They need that infrastructure just as much as the legacy oil and gas infrastructure. They're going to make those types of investments, and so they're going to need the same type of certainty about how they go about those building those types of infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to echo what they both had to say about leveling the playing field and parity. I think that's the conversation we have from that perspective as well. Is that long term the economics will probably play out in clean energy's benefit, and so that's probably going to have to be a part of the trade. And so understanding that creates the opportunity for the outcome you're hoping for is imperative in that conversation. And I think the other piece that we talk about is whether it's setting some timelines like the FAST Act did on how long things can proceed. I think the FAST Act is 2 years, and that's somewhere where we think is acceptable. But also thinking about from a community perspective, acknowledge harms, understand that there is a justifiable trust deficit that a lot of communities have when it comes to these projects, and including something in a trade that is a meaningful kind of community engagement component or community benefit component in kind of acknowledgement of that and understanding that the process is weak now in that perspective and should be strengthened.
That's great. I mean, I just think it's really important to acknowledge, while we will see a lot of benefits, there are going to be attacks on any package from the left and right, and not always, completely, I don't want to say honest attacks, but I think we just have to inoculate ourselves that, these are things that are trade-offs, but it is going to benefit clean energy the most, and that is just the key to lowering emissions. I do want to revisit and go back to some of the things we're all advocating for permitting reform. And in your guys' work in going out and actually doing the advocating on the Hill, like our members are going to go to tomorrow, what's the response been? What messages have you been found resonating with various audiences? Obviously, there's a little bit different appeal to both Republicans and Democrats, progressives and more moderates. What have you guys been seeing in your advocacy around this issue, and what works the best?
I think it's important to start with permitting reform means very different things to different offices. You can break it down by party, you can break it down by region. They all view it as something different. So whether that is judicial reform, whether that is permitting, there's a wide range of what permitting reform means to different offices, and how you approach that is really critical. So I've always made it a priority, whatever office I go and talk to, knowing what their district background is. Have they had rolling blackouts or brownouts from energy shortage, from severe weather, and just knowing if it's a reliability concern, is it a national security concern, And that's how you figure out what is going to be most salient to those offices, and that's how you get the best response. What the response is often just, yeah, we're all working towards it. If you talk to Senate E&R staff, yeah, we want to get this out as soon as possible. If you talk to, yeah, we're close. I've heard that. It's everybody trying to move it forward in their own version, but approaching folks with an understanding of why it's important to their district and what different pieces might help them get in a good spot on it.
One thing just to add to that, I would echo that, and to the point about projects in that specific jurisdiction or whoever you're meeting with in their state, is that as it pertains to NEPA touches basically everything the federal government does. It's not just energy projects. It includes, there's a new fund at Department of Transportation to help accelerate office building to residential conversions in these downtown spaces where all these office buildings are sitting empty. They want to deploy some capital to help further that, but that'll touch NEPA as well. And so in every jurisdiction, one thing I've found is that even offices that aren't necessarily champions of permitting reform or champions of reforming NEPA or the judicial review, they can all of them know about a project that's gotten stuck in there because they've all gotten the calls from their constituents. And so, a bit of research can go a long way, and just find the one thing that's touched that, and they'll get it. And they do get it, they know it, but it always helps to reinforce it, I think, just to understand that, you've done your homework, and also that, it centers it in a way that your conversations might not when they're saying, oh, I'm meeting with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and they come and talk about, the chicken farm or whatever that's gotten stuck up in permitting help.
Yeah, I will.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No,
you sure?
Yeah.
All right. I echo all of that. And, just a couple, I think every member generally and their staff are thinking about, reliable and affordable electricity. So being able to kind of frame it in that perspective as well. And then again, thinking a little bit more on like how progressives might be thinking about this issue. You have to be, again, understand the history of the district, understand what's happened there with projects in the past. You want to be acknowledging that those communities have been harmed and understanding that they have that trust deficit, but speaking to it as an opportunity that this presents to prevent future harms, invest in the community, and the necessity to move quickly to address whether it's an existing pollution burden or like future risks. That's an opportunity to kind of pull that message into what their community needs.
And I was just going to say real quickly, this is not necessarily federal legislation, but in Virginia last year we had 2 different bills in the General Assembly that would have helped with permitting reform. Spoiler alert, they both failed to pass. But one of them was a ban on bans. We've seen localities, yeah, you know about this? So localities across Virginia have been trying to find as many creative ways, either through requirements for solar development or just straight up limiting the amount of acreage that can be used, and functionally banning solar from their localities. There are, I think, 6 that have outright bans, and then another maybe half dozen that have put these overburdensome requirements that make it incredibly difficult to site solar. And that ended up going down. We wanted to include, some SEC requirements for people to be able to appeal. And then the other one was more of like a grab of taking away some of the local control, which is just something that probably is not going to fly in Virginia ever. I mean, even our solar developer partners, Dominion, everybody says, we're happy to work with the localities and go through the normal process, which I understand why they say that, and I believe it. Because community engagement is important. It's something that we all do and that we pride ourselves in. But that other bill put in all kinds of machinations for the state boards to be able to do some of the siting, and that things couldn't be couldn't be automatically rejected out of hand unless they were like 4% of the total land mass in the counties. But one of the things that was really interesting in that at a federal level would also be great is people getting responses to their applications within a timeline, right? Within 120 days, which they said was unreasonable. I'm sure even more so at the federal government. But understaffing is an issue in a lot of these offices, both state and federal, being able to process these applications, being able to do the studies, always having to do the studies in order to get to the next step in the process. I think these are a lot of things that are both slowing down federal, citing procedures, but also at the state and local level, and that's something that we can work on, is being creative about the order, the timeframes, make things predictable for people.
That's great. That's all important stuff. Well, I think now we can go ahead and turn it out to you guys for questions. Flannery, do we have any questions?
We sure do.
What is that?
We have a couple of questions asking if you could just kind of recap what permitting reforms have happened already.
Well, I can do that, or one of our distinguished panelists want to take that?
So I specifically on NEPA in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, this was the bill that passed when the debt ceiling was hit in, I think, the tail end of 2022. We've had so many cliff bills, I feel like. That had a couple of things specific to NEPA. One was it set time limits on how long agencies could take to do to conduct their review. So it set basically, I think it was a 2-year time limit. So basically the idea is any application under NEPA has to be kind of resolved within 2 years. One thing I will say about this is agencies miss deadlines all the time. And it's not necessarily, one thing is, I think predictability is really, really important. But it's also, just setting deadlines is kind of insufficient because it changes kind of the incentives for the agency to potentially rush their environmental review, which is not something we want them to do, and then it becomes more vulnerable in court. Yep. And so I think we need to, one thing with these things is that we can't do this piecemeal. You have to really hit all aspects of this and do something holistically. Otherwise, we can't really move the needle enough that we need.
I think in the other things that, have happened recently that people are talking about is there's the new FERC rules that address planning within regions, and there's some backstop siting authority in national corridors that are then designated by DOE, which was a rule that came out just before the FERC rule. And then there was that, as Rob said, like there's the CEQ rule that came out kind of implementing the things that were included in the debt ceiling. So those are all the things, but I think everybody agrees. There's just a hearing a couple weeks ago in the Senate Energy Committee with energy producers, and everybody universally agrees that congressional action is still needed, and what we've gotten done so far is not adequate to what Arnab said.
The backstop authority that you brought up was actually, they made a tweak to it in the infrastructure IIJA. And I mean, we're still just now trying to figure out what that's going to look like moving forward.
But the reviews are not concurrent.
Yeah,
which is going to slow it down.
Well, and there's questions around does it have the potential to trigger 2 NEPAs, 2 NEPA reviews.
I think there's also the issue that as one of our distinguished board members, Neil Chatterjee, who was a former commissioner and chairman of FERC, brought up the other day on a call that we're about to get a whole bunch of new FERC commissioners that might have a different opinion on what that rule should be when it gets a rehearing. And so none of these things, if it's not done by Congress, it's just not set in stone.
Yeah.
But I think, we can go to another question unless somebody has something to add on
One quick thing on the NITSE, on the corridor designations, just to give you a sense of like how all these things interact with each other. That was a lot. I think that these are transmission corridor designations. Initially, when that law passed that gave them that authority, I think it was probably 15 years ago, they wanted to make them really big corridors. But because of NEPA, if they were to do that, it would have to undergo a full NEPA review, and it would be basically impossible to evaluate all the different reasonable alternatives over such a large geographic area. And so that's just an example where like NEPA is really making it impossible to do some of this transmission build out. So they designated the corridors, but they're much smaller than Congress had initially intended. And so that's where you get into a place where agency action just really has its limits, and that's why we need Congress to fix this.
Well, and that's, you bring up another good point on an agency interpretation versus congressional intent, where I think that and it was EP Act of 2006.
Yeah.
They did a lot of stuff in the bill. But I mean, that's where that backstop authority was created and the NITSEs were created, and we're just now dealing with it. The SITAP rule is from that 2006 bill. This is almost 20 years we've gone through this process, and we're just now starting to unpack how to use these authorities.
Well, and just to tie one more thing that we were talking about earlier, like the judicial process, they tried to do the NITSEs once before after they got the authority, and the courts came in and said, you can't do that. So they had to start over, well, more or less in IIJA.
See, this is a robust discussion we're having. But I think we can do another question, Flannery.
Right. We have a couple of questions about increasing efficiency of transmission lines. So people are wondering about things like reconductoring, minimum transfer requirements. Is all of that possible rather than or in addition to building new transmission lines?
No, it's absolutely a piece of the puzzle. It is. I mean, I think I said towards the beginning of this conversation, the expected build out is or needs for large scale, high capacity transmission is 3 to 4 times what we currently have, and reconductoring and GITs and those types of things are not going to get us there. We need some. And I mean, there's enough. There's a million studies out there on what you can do. I would also point out, because I think you mentioned transfer capacity, which is not quite a technology issue. It is another piece of the puzzle. I think when we talk about it, and we put together a really good map a couple of years ago showing what the capacity was between the different power markets to share power. And you can imagine where some of the hot spots are where they don't have great transfer capacity. Texas has less than 1. The Northeast is really bad about sharing power. When you get to California, it's a little bit better. Some of the best areas is MISO, the middle of the country. They have some of the best interconnection. That's not necessarily a technology issue. That is a structural backbone issue that FERC is taking a look at. I think NERC has been a little bit interested in, and probably still needs some congressional oversight there.
And on the FERC note with regard to GETs and whatnot, and reconductoring, actually FERC's new rule 1920 that they issued, their long-term regional planning rule they issued 2 weeks ago now, I think, it actually requires that they consider in their long-term planning how reconductoring or alternative other grid enhancing technologies can be used beneficially in those processes or as an alternative to like building another project. Because I think one thing, believe it or not, utilities and regions don't do long-term planning in many cases in the United States, and compared to some other nations, we have a relatively low penetration of reconductoring or some of these advanced transmission technologies because it's kind of a if it ain't broke, don't fix it mindset that we know this technology that's 30 years old works all right, so we'll just keep doing it. And so the goal of that rule is to have regions and utilities start considering those more frequently, or in all their planning.
But no, I do think that's a good point because of some of the pushback, we are hearing a little bit. It's like, oh no, we don't need to build anything new. We can just do some of these other things, and as you guys clearly articulated, we got to build stuff. There's just no way around it. There's no magic answer that's going to make everybody happy and not have some of these things happen. We got to build stuff. So I think it's well said.
I'd like to put some numbers on that. Since I took these notes and I haven't gotten a chance to say them yet, this seems like a good opportunity while they've been sitting in front of me. The United States is going to have to invest, and there's a wide range because obviously this is built on a lot of assumptions that we have, 30 to 90 billion in electric transmission above our currently planned investment levels to generate 70 to 200 gigawatts in additional power to meet our electrical demand by 2030. And that's to make sure that we connect all of the new green energy to the grid. One of the things that we focus on with the IBEW, not just in our localities, but also federally, is right sizing, like exactly what we were just talking about when when utilities are planning for the future and the amount of infrastructure that they've had to put into place. Right now we're playing catch up everywhere. I mean, I just talked about the numbers. They're not even planning for the future right now. They're just playing on what we have to do right now to keep our heads above water and keep everybody's lights on. And that's really a conversation that we need to be having in every locality, at every state, at the federal level. Everybody's got a plan for infrastructure. We know this stuff is coming. We're getting a lot of money down from the federal government to incentivize all kinds of people to go into this work and to upgrade the grid. We gotta plan the projects accordingly.
One thing, just to piggyback off of David's point, is we've been blessed in this country to have, I mean, from a take the climate out of it for a second, to have a lot of natural gas, which is very cheap, and that's made our electricity cheap, and it's been a boon for our economy. And if we want to move off of that, we need to just find ways to also get more reps building this stuff out so that the cost reductions come so that it can compete with natural gas, which is like a really important economic aspect of this. And if we want to have, a big manufacturing boom in jobs, we need electricity for that. And so we really, really do need to, build a lot more.
I was talking to a solar developer earlier today, heard a conversation that they were having, and in order for this land that they have there where they've been trying to build this utility scale solar project, it turns out that they're going to either have to build or reconduct 20 miles of transmission lines, which makes the whole thing immediately way too expensive, and it's just not going to happen, right? And that's sad that we don't have the infrastructure in place for people who have the type of a local appetite to actually get something done. That's another barrier is the cost of our aged infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. That interconnection problem is not uncommon.
Yeah, absolutely. Flannery, I think we're ready for another one.
All right. What can we tell our members of Congress about the numbers of new jobs and apprenticeships in the electrical industry that could be created if we speed up permitting?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I think this one has to do with me and Kyle, maybe. In terms of apprenticeships, so it's not just the electricians who are doing, the checkdowns and the grounding at the ends of the lines of solar panels. It's also solar installers, right? So the people actually placing the panels. It's the operating engineers who go through and clear the land and prep the space. It's the laborers, LIUNA members who are going through and actually helping installing these things. So we're talking about union jobs across the board if folks are trying to be compliant with the IRA and get their tax credits, right? And that's because we have apprenticeships, local hiring, and best-in-class safety standards, right? And when they work with the union and union contractors, they know that they can assume that all of those criteria are met and that they can, get those financial incentives from the government. So every time we do a utility scale project, we're talking about dozens, if not, over 100 workers working for however many months, depending on the size, right? I can tell you, we just did the largest, here in DC, the largest solar array in the history of in the city. We put together like 120, put people to work, like 120 people for over 6 months, right, to build that from the ground up at the U.S. Postal Service. So there are, the sky's the limit, but as with everything, whenever I go and lobby localities or the federal government, the only way that we can guarantee that we can continue to provide these pathways to the middle class. And by the way, Local 26, a journeyman right now, We just finished our collective bargaining agreement for the next 3 years. It's going to be up over $62 an hour over the next period. Right now, it's $53 an hour. So we're talking about, and by the way, everybody has open overtime after 8 hours, time and a half, after 10 double time. So our folks are making over 6 figures, right? Not to mention another $25,000 in benefits and healthcare. We got 2 pensions, we got an annuity. If anybody'd like to hear about the apprenticeship and sign up, come see me after this. I'm ready to organize you in. Or your kids, or your grandkids. But the only way that we can promote those opportunities of those great jobs with those incredible benefits is if we have the work building these solar arrays or upgrading LEED certifications in buildings downtown, or installing heat pumps, in buildings for decarbonization, or EV charging infrastructure. Like we have the certification, the training, everything set up to be successful and to scale to meet the work picture. So I can tell you we'll continue to bring on more and more people. Here in DC, I have an incredible opportunity to work with Solar for All and the Green Trades DC program, which is a lot of what Kyle talks about. We get to go into the 7th and 8th wards. We go into all different parts of the city and get folks into a pre-apprenticeship programs for a year, 2 years, and help them prepare to get into the apprenticeship. So that we can put them in those photovoltaic classes and have them installing solar panels. So the answer is the sky is the limit. We just need to fight to get the projects approved, and then I can take as many as possible. So right now, dozens, hundreds, it could be thousands.
Yeah, I'll just add one other angle that we look at. The local hiring thing, totally agree with. It's an immediate investment in the community and creates opportunity. From our perspective, when we think about our criminal justice work, we see the clean energy workforce as an opportunity for folks that are, leaving a carceral facility. Maybe they're in a halfway house, who are looking for an opportunity to build a career that can be family sustaining or, propel them into the middle class. We look at pre-apprenticeship or apprenticeship readiness programs that are often either in and paired with the halfway house or are part of a carceral facility. And we really see that as a pathway to success for them and creating an opportunity to reduce mass incarceration and recidivism. And so that's an example of where you might think of an issue that's completely unrelated, but these things come together in a way that is not always obvious.
I think that's a great point to bring that stuff in, because even though we're primarily thinking about emissions reductions, there are these other goods that we can bring that just span the gamut. So I think that's really, really great to bring that into the conversation. We got time for a couple more, Flannery, or where are we at?
We have time for a few more.
All right, great.
We got a lot of questions about local opposition to projects. So can you speak a little bit about how much the federal permitting reform process can help that? People are just noticing a lot of, the county commissioner can block things that have been already approved by the state's power board, things like that. So can you speak about the challenges at the local level?
Yeah, you want to say?
Yeah, I would say, outside of things like backstop authority, for example, that create a way for the federal government to preempt where necessary local or state governments. You can't and probably don't want the federal government to be in the business of steamrolling local opposition, but we can at least remove the barriers that local minorities, vocal local minorities, have the federal tools that they can use to block projects. And so that's really how we view how NEPA is being weaponized, essentially, right? Which is, this is a tool for a very small vocal group of people, even when projects have overwhelming support among the community, among elected leaders. Basically every check mark that you would have unions for democratic legitimacy in terms of support, a small group can still, file a lawsuit and tie a project up in court. And so at least, you're never going to be able to fully eradicate that, and you probably shouldn't, that their voices still do matter. But if we can take away the tools for them to endlessly weaponize opposition against projects, that would be good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when we talk about it, especially with infrastructure, the focus being on the high capacity projects that bring the most benefit. They're moving multi-states. Those are the ones to focus on, right? You're going to have something that spans multiple states, have a clear federal role. I would argue that backstop authority is a kind of muddy federal role, the way that the developer has to get rejected and then come back. It's not the best process. But having clear federal authority for projects that are going to have major benefits to decarbonization is really the key here, so that you're minimizing the issues with local and state, leaving as much of the local and state at the local and state as possible, while still identifying those more beneficial projects.
Yeah, and I would say the thing that I've been interested in at a state level is passing legislation that takes away some of the regulatory, some of the requirements that, frankly, localities use as a weapon to prevent these things, and maybe come up with, instead of just saying you can't do this from a state level, say this is what you should be thinking of in citing solar, and give a set of requirements, at least a baseline that localities can work from. Because right now it's the Wild West out there. People are doing their own independent studies, looking at other localities and just making stuff up that just isn't tethered to reality at all. So if we could just have a little bit of grounding, I think that would be good. I want to make a distinction, right, between conservationists and environmentalists, right? And I think that this is something that always gets a little fuzzy, and we all get tied together into big groups a lot of times. But in general, when I find doing clean energy work, there are groups that parade as environmentalists who are really conservationists, which it boils down to being NIMBYs. They don't want any type of projects built or sited in their localities, right? Whereas I work with environmentalists like the Citizens Climate Lobby, who are interested in coming out and pushing for reform so that we can actually, meet the demands of future power generation. So there are always going to be conservationists in every locality fighting every project, especially if they can say crazy things about the solar panels killing birds, or groundwater contamination, or like runoff, or any number of things that they like to talk about, battery storage facilities blowing up, like stuff that's just not, once again, not tethered in reality, right? And the way that we fight that, more than legislation, more than local ordinances, is by having other voices in support at the table. Because at the end of the day, these boards, right, these planning commissioners, but really the boards of supervisors or county commissioners or whatever you call them where you're from, right, they rely on you to get elected, right? Votes are what puts them in office. So they pay attention to what the voters are saying. So you show up with just as large a group or a little bit larger group than the opposition, all of a sudden, especially if it's something that they already agree with, it gives them cover, or it can sway them, right? Just as if they already agree with you but nobody shows up and the opposition shows up, then it can sway them the other way. So it's incredibly important to get active and to show up for those votes and to advocate for projects that you want. That will be more powerful than anything that we try to do, taking away local authority on siting, which frankly there's not a huge appetite for anyway.
I think it's well said. Yeah.
All right, we can squeeze in one last question here in these last 2 minutes. What is your top tip for talking to members of Congress about this topic tomorrow? And this question comes from a student who points out that they are making this ask in all 3 lobby meetings, and they have never lobbied in person before. So give them a little dose of confidence here. What's your tip?
I mean, know who you're going in to talk to. Look at their most recent press releases, their Twitter, their Facebook page, see what they've been talking about, see if there's an opportunity. See if they've said anything on what you're going in to talk about, and B, see what their priorities are. If they're extremely hostile to labor, pitch it as jobs. Don't pitch it as labor. It's small nuances like that that can go a long way in having a productive conversation with staff, with the member, with whoever you're meeting with.
Spoken like a true former House staffer.
Yeah, I'll use my former CCL hat here for a second. I would say trust your preparation. Your teams here have done a great job, giving you one-pagers on the issues so that you're an expert. You've got the organization of the volunteers and your roles that you're walking into the meeting with. You have the backgrounder on your members. So, trust your people that you're going in with, trust that the organization has prepared you, they have, and if you do as well, if I echo what Corey said as well, you'll be just fine.
Well, we might be more prepared if you hadn't left us, Kyle.
Hey, I'm still contributing.
Any final thoughts?
The hill's full of kids, so treat it with seriousness, obviously, but these aren't always experts as well. Don't assume prior knowledge. Like these people, they're trying to learn, and they're also very taxed with a lot of information. And so the more you can simplify things for them, I think the best.
And I would just say, yeah, keep it simple. Try to make it personal, connected to real people. Set the context of everything, right? This big looming power crisis that we have, right? And the existential threat of climate change, obviously. Depending on who you're talking to, though, I think it's incredibly important to know who the members are, what state they're from, what's important to those states' economies. A lot of you probably will end up meeting with staffers, not just members. Still, share the information. Don't get bummed out about it. Do it the same way that you would, because they're going to go and give a report. As someone who used to be a staffer as well, they get full reports on the meetings that they had from the day. And one thing that I always like to tell folks when I'm training them for a lobby day, on top of all those other things, smile, be calm, it's okay. Don't make stuff up, right? You're gonna be you're gonna be well prepared. You're gonna have your one-pagers and all that stuff. They ask you something that's related to the one-pager that you don't really necessarily know. Don't go off script and just make up stuff about what you're lobbying for that you don't know. You'll have people there who you can turn to, who can lean into those things.
David is speaking from all of our personal experience.
Well, thank you so much, guys. This was a really good panel. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you, everybody. We have a 15-minute break now, and if you'd like to chat with our panelists, please give them a moment to get all the way off the stage and back here to the back of the room. We'll see you back here in about 15 minutes for the next breakout session.